All righty, excellent. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be at CraftConf. This is a conference that has given me FOMO for many years, fear of missing out. It's great to actually be here. And one of the things they asked us to do as we were loading our presentations is to offer tags on the presentations. And I realized that I couldn't quite bring myself to do it, but I should have tagged history on my talk because honestly, all my talks begin with a bit of history. And I'm talking today about ethical dilemmas in software engineering. And so I'm going to turn the Wayback Dial to 1997. I'm not going to ask how many of you are alive in 1997 because I think that most of you are, but I know that is changing. So I know not to ask that question even. But if we look at the Code of Ethics from the ACM circa 1997, these were published in the communications of the ACM. And you know, they start off with these kind of timeless ideas. So certainly it is as true now, much or even more true, that computers have a central and growing role in commerce, industry, government, medicine, education, entertainment, social affairs, and ordinary life. I love like social affairs. I don't think that person was predicting social networking circa 1997. Little did we know what we had in store. But this kind of starts off very reasonably, like we want to have a code of ethics because software is becoming more and more important. And they kind of expand on this a little bit, and one of the things that I actually really like about this code of ethics circa 1997 is that they emphasize that this code is not a simple ethical algorithm. And you know, like, look, we're all quantitative people. If you're like me, if you're a computer scientist in your marrow, you liked discrete math a lot more than continuous math. We like things to be kind of binary. So we all kind of like, where is the algorithm for ethics? Give me the algorithm that I can think, no, there is no algorithm. I know, I'm sorry. For ethical obligations, we're not going to have an algorithm. We're not going to be able to reproduce the same results with every input. And you're going to have to actually embrace the fact that there's going to be nuance, that in some cases standards may conflict. And these situations will require the software engineer to use ethical judgment. You're like, judgment? Okay, what's that? To act in a manner that is most consistent with the spirit of the code. So this setup all seems good. So now we're ready to read the code circa 1997. We're ready to look at what are our first principles such that we may behave non-algorithmically and ethically. Principle 1, product. You're like, is product a principle? Like, does that word not mean what I think it means? This is the first commandment. Software engineers shall, insofar as possible, assure that the software in which they work is useful. Okay, we're already on shaky ground. And of acceptable quality to the public, shakier. The employer, the client, and the user completed on time, and at reasonable cost, oh boy, and free of error. You're like, oh, come on! In particular, software engineers shall, as appropriate, 1.01, specification 1.01, the first commandment, ensure that specifications for software on which they work have been well documented, satisfy the user's requirements, and have the client's approval. It's like, I don't think any software engineer survives this first principle intact. Certainly, I have been unethical many, many, many times based on just 1.01. But if you may be, hey, you know what, I'm the exception. No, I'm sorry. I don't know what's wrong with everybody else. But for me, the specifications always have been well documented, and they always have satisfied the user's requirements and have had the client's approval. Like, okay, great, you're terrific. Let's see how many of these you survive. Have you ensured proper and achievable goals, okay? And objectives for any project on which they work or proposed work. Ensure an appropriate methodology for any project in which they work or proposed to work, okay? And then, if there is any software engineer left standing after 1.05 1.06 is designed to finish you off and assure that you are always behaving unethically, because by 1.06 you must ensure good management for any project on which they work, including effective procedures for promotion of quality and reduction of risk. And then 1.07, ensure realistic estimates of cost, scheduling, personnel, and outcome on any project on which they work or propose to work. Okay, so like we're all dead, right? We are all, and the surrounding context was great, but this is nutty. I mean, this does not make any sense whatsoever. Buried deep in there, you have to go to section 6.10. You do have one that I think is actually pretty important and pretty timeless, namely, obey all laws governing their work, insofar as such obedience is consistent with the public health, safety, and welfare. So there's some stuff that's in here that's good, but in general, these are not all that good. But they kind of sum it up. By, I think, in a thoughtful way, that you can address these by kind of thoughtful consideration of these fundamental principles rather than reliance on detailed regulations. But then why all the emphasis on on doing things that we know we can't do in software, like shipping things on schedule, on time, and error-free? That's really, really, really hard to do in software. And it's not unethical. I'm sorry. It's not unethical when a project is more complicated than you anticipated it being. So while there's nothing wrong per se with these, they are crazily dated. I mean, this is from the pre-Cambrian era of software. And I like that surrounding context, but the actual code itself is, quaint is basically the best way you can describe it. And software has changed, and in many ways it serves to remind us how cute and small software was in 1997, and how much more important software has become with its relationship with society. We end up with software has grown a lot since 1997, and we've come into contact with a lot of ethical dilemmas, honestly. And we saw this a bit with the ubiquitous rise of the internet in the late 1990s. We saw some of the foreshocks of what was going to become the complications of software. So remember Napster, 1999? Yeah, exactly. This is where you get the Gen Xers raising their hands. This is kind of I'm pointing out Napster as a first body of software that showed us that things were going to get complicated, because Napster was software back in the day for downloading, ripping MP3s, and playing music, generally in violation of the copyright of the music holder, right? The person who created the music. But it didn't feel that illegal. I mean, that's a terrible excuse, but a lot of people use Napster, and there was this huge disconnect between what record labels were charging and what people wanted to pay, honestly, for music, and Napster kind of came in there, realistically, we were entering an ethical gray area as we were using the software and as you're implementing the software. If you're implementing Napster, you were implementing software that was designed for people to basically circumvent the law. Again, it didn't feel that way. It felt playful. It felt fun until Napster was shut down by the recording industry. That felt a lot less fun. So this was kind of a foreshock. Then in 2003, we had Friendster. Oh, Friendster. So if you happen to be alive in 2003 and on the internet, there was this glorious summer of 2003 when we all discovered social networking. And Friendster went from nothing to explosive in the span of like 60 days. And as someone who was living in San Francisco during that time, I can tell you it was just fun. We were all discovering social networking. And of course, what were people doing as they were discovering social networking? They were having fun with it. They were putting their cats online, and their cats were befriending their neighbors' cats. And then like the signpost down the street, that would be online. And then both cats befriend the signpost, which was great. And one of the funny things about Friendster was all of the cats and the signposts are frantically getting deleted because we only want to have actual people on here. And this dude was just way uptight about only people being on Friendster, only people. You can't put your cat on a social network. It's like, come on, why can't we put my cat on a social network? Oh, you don't want me to put my cat on a social network because you don't want to date my cat. I get it. So social networking, and I think we kind of forget this, social networking was born crooked. Social networking was born so Jonathan Abrams could meet girls. That was the point of social networking. And your cat, frankly, is getting in the way of his ability to meet girls online. And so there was this deep disingenuousness about social networking, and disingenuousness that social networking still hasn't outgrown. Who is Facebook for? Who now is Facebook for my mom sharing photos of a trip she took recently to her loved ones? That's who she perceives as being for. That's not who Facebook perceives it as being for. And so that disingenuousness with Friendster, I think, was a foreshock of what was to come. And then you hit 2011 and Mark Andreessen and his prophecy. And if you haven't read this essay recently, it absolutely merits a reread. This is 8 years ago now, Why Software is Eating the World. And honestly, it's deeply prophetic. That Mark Andreessen writes that more and more businesses and industries are being run on software and delivered as online services. From movies to agriculture to national defense, many of the winners are Silicon Valley-style entrepreneurial technology companies that are invading and overturning established industry structures. And the prophecy part, over the next 10 years, I expect many more industries to be disrupted by software, with new world-beating Silicon Valley companies doing the disruption in more cases than not. Now, as someone who lives and works in Silicon Valley, at the time, actually, I just thought this was obvious. But it wasn't obvious, it was prophetic. And I can tell you that Silicon Valley cheers this paragraph, or did. It's like, yay, Silicon Valley companies doing the world beating more often than not. But it should have been a warning that Silicon Valley needed to grow up, that tech companies needed to grow up, because there was a tsunami of social interaction coming, societal interaction coming, that we were ill-prepared for. So what I want to do is I want to walk through some of the ethical dilemmas that we have seen since Andreessen's prophecy in 2011. And I'm going to walk through these. I picked one from each year. You could pick 10,000 more probably, but I've tried to pick things that I think are true dilemmas for which there is complexity and ambiguity. And I'm not trying to take 8 different things and blame people for them. Quite the contrary, because I think that with a lot of these, if you yourself had been in their same shoes, you might have done the same thing. And that indeed is the point, is that there is complexity, there is ambiguity. And I think that one of the challenges we've got is that those who are most likely to encounter this ambiguity are those that are least troubled by it. I have always been troubled by Facebook, I'll tell you bluntly. I've always been troubled by Facebook. As a result, I have never worked for Facebook. The people that have worked for Facebook are not troubled by Facebook, which is fine. Not that everyone should be troubled by Facebook, but it means that there's a degree to which one is less equipped to deal with the ambiguities that Facebook encountered. And let's kick it off with Facebook, because in 2012, Facebook absolutely crossed a Rubicon. In 2012, researchers started to manipulate the news feed of hundreds of thousands of people as part of an experiment. So what they did is they took positive sentiment and positive sentimented posts and put them in the news feed of one group, negatively sentimented posts in the news feed of another group, and neutral posts, because they're good scientists, in the news feed of a third. That means that you may not have, someone had great news that they just had a new baby. You may not have seen that in your news feed if you were one of the negative groups. Because that may have been selected out for you, and instead you may have gotten news about how someone that you once went to high school with was battling breast cancer. These are very real things. There are real people underneath that sentiment analysis, but that seems to be devoid here. And indeed, the researchers themselves, how do they defend their action? The researchers themselves say that they kind of describe what they did in terms of Hadoop and MapReduce, but they point out that no text was seen by the researchers. As such, it was consistent with Facebook's data use policy, constituting informed consent for this research. Come on. This is not informed consent. I don't think anyone would have said that it was informed consent. Now, in 2012, I don't think these researchers were necessarily lying to themselves. I think that they had a pretty interesting idea that they wanted to go explore, and they ignored the fact that they actually didn't have informed consent, and that they were manipulating people's emotions and then reasoning about them. And these aren't mice. These are people who have actual real lives and are potentially actually seriously impacted by your manipulation of their emotions. And if you know folks at Facebook, I think that they will tell you that this was a Rubicon for Facebook, because this is where Facebook began to perform experiments, either in the name of academic research, as in this case, or in the case, much more frequently, in the case of actually generating revenue. And they lost their hesitation for doing these kinds of manipulations, which is a real problem. Then we have, so 2013, and by the way, these could all be Facebook, but I think that would be boring. Facebook, and that's not necessarily a criticism of Facebook. I guess it's a kind of a perverse compliment that Facebook is so dominant that they have encountered every ethical dilemma one can conceive of. But I want to, we'll pick some other examples, and one of them that feels plausible to me is Zenefits. So Zenefits was, I guess still is, a Silicon Valley startup that was going to disrupt the insurance industry. Sounds great. In order to actually build their software, they had to be certified by the state of California, by a regulatory board. And in order to do that, you have to sit through 52 hours of training studying the materials. And the way this is done is over the web browser and kind of, clicking next and so on. And the CEO came up with what we might call a hack. It's like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to actually develop a Chrome plugin that is actually going to plug into the browser and pretend like I'm there and take the training for me. Doesn't this feel like, this sounds great, we automated it, right? We took something that was tedious and manual, and I've automated it with this little script. And it feels plausible. I think if that doesn't feel plausible to you, you might be lying to yourself. It feels plausible to me. If a coworker did that, I don't know that I would think to ask the follow-up question of like, wait a minute, what is this training for? Who's administering it? What are the consequences of this? And the consequences were pretty grave. Also, I think the time, perversely, the time kind of makes a difference. Like, if it's like a 5-minute video, that's one thing, but like, wow, 52 hours? But the time really shouldn't make a difference, right? In terms of this particular dilemma, we shouldn't be asking that question. We should be asking broader questions about what the ramifications are and what is the law? What does the law say we need to do? Because we actually do need to abide by the law. This was a huge scandal, and this is actually from the findings of fact with the SEC pursuing against Parker Conrad. He lost his job over it, and it was a very big deal that continues to kind of haunt Zenefits to this day. And I think it revealed a culture that wasn't asking these kinds of questions. 2014, Uber Greyball. So I've heard of Uber Greyball. Uber, this is in the time when Uber is trying to enter all of these cities, and there were some cities around the US in particular, and I'm sure around the globe, that had great reticence about allowing Uber into their city, and they had regulations in place that actually prevented Uber from driving in that city. So what Uber did is they knew that those regulators, in this case it's Portland, that those regulators were potentially going to be just downloading the app and looking to see how many Ubers were driving on the street to monitor them. So they invented this software called Greyball that gave those regulators a different view of Uber, namely one that had no cabs on it. And exactly, it kind of feels like, I don't know, isn't that kind of clever? A little bit? It's a little bit clever, a little bit. It's a little bit devious. And it's probably wrong, or is wrong, when what you're deceiving is a regulator. That regulator isn't trying to enforce the law. This is not cat and mouse. And your job is not to try to evade regulation, especially when you are clearly violating every aspect of that regulation, the letter and the spirit. So this is from the findings of fact, and I love the kind of different tone where this is Portland themselves saying that Uber used Greyball software to intentionally evade PBOT's officers from December 5th, December 19th, 2014, and deny 29 separate ride requests by PBOT enforcement officers. Uber's letter back is much more like, it doesn't feel like it's that big of a deal. Okay, yeah, wait, there's a 2-week period where I was misleading you, but it was pretty short. I didn't do it that long. Come on. And I think that this shows you a bit of moral relativism, that it's like committing crimes for merely a 2-week period of time. That doesn't in any way absolve you of the responsibility of what you've done. So that's 2014 and Uber Greyball. Then get to 2015. And this is one that I feel is one that is going to increasingly come up. So this is where the Google software, their network, their deep neural network has mistakenly identified a dark-skinned individual as a gorilla. And now Google, to their credit, Google handled this very well. Google, or as well as you could handle it. Google immediately took down the software in question. They got in front of it. They figured out what had happened. They did everything you could conceivably do. But it highlighted a real crack in the foundation in that this is the kind of the great lie, honestly, of the current AI boom, is that it actually relies on humans at the bottom doing classification, doing image classification. And if the data that you use to do that classification is itself biased, that bias will show up at the top. And it's one thing if it's abhorrent that this is just in a kind of an image identification, but if this is actually going to inform a loan application, if we're going to actually act on this societally, and I think it highlights a real dilemma that we have in AI right now, which is how do we explain its results? The AI has made this decision. Okay, well, yeah, the AI, it's actually not intelligent. It's just acting. It's actually just recognizing patterns. Why did it identify this as that pattern? And as it misidentifies things, and by the way, this is innocent in that Google did not intentionally misfeed its network the wrong data. Right? It did not tamper with its own training data to be non-representative. It just was non-representative. God forbid what's going to happen when we allow people to actually generate training data for us. Remember Microsoft Tay? Microsoft Tay was going to be this chatbot that was going to learn from what you speak. Well, as soon as 4chan got a hold of this, which was like, what, 30 microseconds after they announced it? I mean, the latency between like announcement, 4chan discovering it, and Microsoft Tay being the most despicable racist you've ever encountered in your life was shocking. I mean, it was way less than a day. It was like within 30 minutes, Microsoft Tay is like volunteering things. They're just like, whoa, my goodness. Have you been hanging out on 4chan? It's like, I actually have been hanging out on 4chan. Glad you asked that question. 4chan's great. It's like, no. 4chan is not great. 4chan is everything that's wrong with us societally. And the fact that Microsoft Tay was hanging out there very quickly learned all of the wrong things. And we've got a lot of ethical dilemmas ahead of us as we get more deep neural nets and as we make them make more decisions. We've got a lot of these kind of dilemmas ahead of us. And if you are working on that kind of technology, you've got to be asking yourself, how are we making decisions? Why are we making decisions this way? And how are we taking responsibility for those decisions? How can we explain them? So I think this is going to be a huge issue over the next 5 and 10 years. Then we get to 2016, the first Tesla autopilot fatality. I'm sorry, I'm going to put autopilot in air quotes because it's not a correct representation of what the automobile can do. This is not a self-driving car. This is a car that has got traffic avoiding cruise control and has got some steering assist. That is what it is, but it has been sold and marketed as an autopilot. And as a result, drivers don't necessarily read every sentence of the manual, read every word of the manual, and they think, quite rightfully, that when they're driving, they can let their attention drift. And in this case, the attentiveness of the driver drifted for reasons that are unknown, and this car did not see a semi-truck that had pulled in front of it making a left turn because it was looking at the road underneath it. And this car went under the semi-truck, and the driver was killed essentially instantly. And again, we don't know why that driver was distracted, but very clearly that driver believed, quite rightfully, that the car was driving itself, and it wasn't. And this is not the only fatality we've seen. We saw one recently in Silicon Valley where the car actually followed the wrong line, and it followed the right-hand marker of a left exit as the left marker of the lane, and it went driving into the pavement at top speed. Again, this is not an autopilot. That's not an accurate representation of what it's doing. And the fact that it's killing people is a really serious problem. And it's a serious problem because the reason this is happening goes pretty deep. And there are plenty who work on self-driving cars who will tell you that Tesla's total lack of LiDAR is not responsible. Tesla can't see, it's relying on cameras to see things, and they are appealing to I think, a very bad argument, namely that humans are able to drive with 2 eyes. Why can't a computer? It's like, well, because a computer is not an actual human, you numpty. And we've got the technology for a computer to actually know when objects are in front of us with LiDAR, but they're not on these cars because of economic cost. Well, maybe if it's too expensive to not be able to kill people, can we at least call it what it actually is, which is a driver assist? And it can be viewed as a safety mechanism as long as the driver is in charge. But you've got a lot of people at Tesla who are trying to do what they perceive is the right thing, but they should view themselves as being in a quandary with respect to these vehicles and how they're being marketed and sold and tweeted about. It's a major problem. And if you look at the NTSB's conclusion on this, the NTSB's conclusion, I mean, God bless. So the NTSB is the National Transportation Safety Board in the United States. This is the last government agency in the United States that I, as a worn-out American, have any faith in. So please allow me my NTSB. I love the NTSB. The NTSB always kind of figures it out. And in particular, the NTSB looked at this particular crash in Williston, Florida, and it concluded that the problem here is actually how this thing is being sold and marketed. That this is actually just a level 2 vehicle automation system, and it is being marketed as much more than that. And our recommendation is that you actually use these things the way they were designed, which is as an enhancement to the driver, not as a replacement for the driver. All right, 2017. I got to come back to Facebook a little bit. So in Myanmar, there is a Muslim ethnic minority called the Rohingya. And in Myanmar, Facebook effectively is the internet. Facebook is by far and away the dominant way of actually getting to the internet, and Facebook messages were used to coordinate effectively a genocide against the Rohingya in which 75,000 people died. And this is an issue of true ambiguity. What is Facebook's responsibility here? Because Facebook is not advocating the genocide of the Rohingya, clearly. To what degree is Facebook enabling it merely by being a communications platform? Because Facebook's answer to this is like, look, we're just kind of like, we're a radio transmitter. And we just transmit whatever people say. And it's not our job as the radio transmitter to actually audit what people say. And I don't agree with that. I think a lot of people don't agree with that. And I don't agree with that because it was a radio transmitter that was used to broadcast instructions for genocide in the 1994 Rwandan genocide of Hutus against Tutsis. And the way that was done was with a radio transmitter. And the UN general on the ground, Romeo Dallaire, tried to communicate back to anyone who would listen, could somebody please bomb the radio transmitter? This is what a bomb is for. No humans will be killed. We need to bomb the radio transmitter, and then they cannot broadcast instructions for this genocide. Well, in this case, Facebook is the radio transmitter. And there's a responsibility here, but it's ambiguous. I don't know where that responsibility begins and ends. I don't think anybody wants a Facebook to need to approve every single post on Facebook, and yet the end result was really not acceptable. And if you see that there was a huge spike in all of these posts on Facebook as the genocide was undertaken. Now, one thing that Facebook actually did right, and I think it's kind of a template for people who do end up in an ethical quandary, is I think that they were rightfully horrified by what happened. I think Facebook's been horrified by a lot of things that have happened, but I think they're crippled because they don't understand how to act. And in this case, I actually think they acted reasonably well, at least at the start. They commissioned a group to actually go explore this rigorously, which is great. That commission delivered a series of recommendations, also great. Those recommendations were then ignored by Facebook, a lot less great. So when you have, and I think having these kind of independent findings of fact is incredibly valuable, but you've got to listen to them. And in particular, what the action that Facebook has done is that they have deplatformed a handful of these Buddhist extremist groups, but they've left a bunch of other extremist groups on all sides of this on the platform and continuing to be involved. And they haven't actually yet meaningfully employed boots on the ground who actually speak Burmese, who can actually make reasonable human decisions. And this is one of these examples where we in software fixate on getting the human out of the loop. How can we automate everything? This is an example where we need to de-automate. And there are going to be more examples of this, where we need to get a human back in the loop. We need to stop fooling ourselves about the coming singularity and know that human judgment is not going to be replaced anytime soon, and we need to deliberately get it back in the loop. And the question should be, how can we get it back in the loop with optimally, cost-effectively, and so on, but let's harness that human judgment, please. Which itself, by the way, is very difficult. I mean, there have been, and I know there have been news stories about this, but about those folks that have been tasked with keeping inappropriate material off things like YouTube. That job is horrific, and people see horrific things, and they start to believe some of these kind of crazy conspiracy theories that they are actually in charge of keeping off the platform. So clearly, we can't go all the way and say, like, well, we need human judgment on everything. There's going to have to be a delicate balance. Again, a lot of complexity, a lot of ambiguity, but simply saying it's not our problem, that's not okay. And lest I sound too sanctimonious and too judgmental, let me, for 2018, let's talk about our own problem that we had at Joyent. So there was a dreadful shooting at a Pittsburgh mosque late last year, and the Pittsburgh shooter was on a platform called Gab, and Gab is an alt-right Twitter, effectively, and the Pittsburgh shooter was very much ginned up by his activities on Gab. Gab was a Joyent customer. It pains me to say. They weren't shortly after this, and we moved very quickly to take them off our platform, but we moved after the incident. This is not something we caught before the incident. And I can tell you that every Joyent employee was asking themselves pretty serious questions. Was my software complicit in this horrible massacre? I mean, at some level, yes, at some level, in that your software wrote the platform on which the software platform was written, on which the shooter was actively engaged. So at some level, yes. I don't think we bear culpability per se, but I also think that we need to think about what our own responsibility is there. Fortunately, in this case, such as it is, we actually have an acceptable use policy that is pretty broad and allows us to act quickly in this case. And to this day, there are many people who believe, or some people, who believe that this is a First Amendment issue, that Gab should have the right to be on our platform. No one has the inalienable right to be your customer because of how they behave. And if someone behaves poorly, they don't need to be your customer. And don't get fooled into these kind of constitutional arguments and so on. When someone behaves unacceptably, you can boot them off your platform. You can say what you want, but not in my bar. If you're in my bar, I can kick you out of my bar for saying things that I deem to be horrific and unacceptable. So if you don't have an acceptable use policy and you have any public exposure, I very much encourage you to get one. But this was an extremely difficult moment for us at Joyent, and one that I think gave us empathy for some of these other folks that find themselves in these dilemmas, that these are not necessarily bad acting people, but they find themselves in really difficult situations and ones that are very regrettable. All right, so for 2019, you could pick a lot of things for 2019. You could go pick on Facebook again. You could go pick on, one thing that riles me up in 2019 about Facebook, I don't know if you saw this, where they are going after teenagers to get their data and paying teenagers $20 to offer up all their data, which my 14-year-old will gladly take $20 to offer up everything about himself. In fact, you have overbid with my 14-year-old. He'll do it for $5. But you know what? That's why my 14-year-old is a child, because he has an undeveloped prefrontal cortex, and he can't make these decisions on his own, and he needs mom and dad to make those decisions for him. I love him, obviously, but he's a child. And Facebook going after kids is truly abhorrent. But I don't want to go back to Facebook yet again, although I guess I just did. The one that actually, for 2019, you got to talk about the 737 MAX and the MCAS system. So this is the maneuvering capability augmentation system that was put in the 737 MAX. And the story here is that Boeing needed to react quickly to the Airbus. The Airbus had developed a new, more efficient plane, and Boeing needed to react very quickly to it. And they wanted to develop a new 737. 737. There's a problem with that. They wanted to develop a new 737 that did not require any recertification. So this is going to be a 737 that's going to look and fly exactly like the old 737, such that we don't need to recertify anyone. There's a problem with that. In order to make it more efficient, the engines had to be larger. In order for the engines to be larger, they need to be moved. And by moving the engines, you actually change the way the aircraft flew. And then they had an idea that, and the reason I mention this in a software talk, they've got an idea that just feels very inspired by software. And that is, oh, you're saying the aircraft flies a little differently. Okay, so what if we put in a module that detects when the aircraft is being flown differently and just flies it like it was flying before? It's like, that sounds crazy. But that's what they did with the MCAS. The MCAS will detect high angles of attack, and it will automatically adjust the aircraft to fly the way that the aircraft used to fly. The problem is, they didn't actually tell any of the pilots about this, because to do that would have revealed the fact this is a different aircraft that probably requires new certification. And this has already resulted in 2 fatal, severe crashes. Not all crashes are equal. Both of these crashes lost all lives. So this is Lion Air 610, Ethiopian 302, and in both these cases, the pilots were fighting this mechanism that was doing the wrong thing. And the mechanism is pointing the nose down when they're trying to pull it up and pull it back. Why was it doing the wrong thing? Because it had actual bad data. The angle of attack sensor was wrong. And Boeing is putting out a software update that's like, okay, we got a software update. We are now, the flight control system will now compare inputs from both angle of attack sensors. And you're like, will now? Now that we've got hundreds of people dead, it will now factor in both angle of attack sensors. Where was this when you were actually designing the aircraft? Well, the problem is this aircraft, and again, I don't blame software, but it feels like a move fast, break things kind of aircraft. And it used to be that folks that were making aircraft felt a great deal of responsibility to those involved and would never have engaged in a move fast and break things kind of aircraft. And indeed, when cockpits became software controlled in the 80s, there was a lot of consternation about how a software bug would bring down an airliner. That basically has not happened. And that hasn't happened because there was a great deal of discipline. But now, software is involved in taking down 2 airliners, not because of a defect, not because of a bug, but because of a culture that wanted this aircraft to be done now rather than being done right. And it was a huge problem. It spread to the horizon at Boeing, and there are lots of people, again, not bad people, but lots of people who I'm sure are questioning their own behavior, and damn it, I should have said something. I should have asked why we were doing it this way, and I'm sure many of them did, and that will be revealed as time goes on. But so they're now going to compare inputs from both angle of attack sensors. The MCAS would also fight the pilots, so we're going to stop doing that. And we're never going to, the MCAS also would put would change the aircraft more than the pilots could change it back, which is part of the reason that Ethiopian 302 crashed. So this is a very serious problem. This will be rectified. I've got total faith in our system and in its ability to rectify it. But it should be a lesson to all of us that the software way of thinking is invading too much of society. So this is just this is a tiny sampling of the ethical dilemmas we've seen. There are lots and lots more of them. You probably have several of your own that you've encountered. And one thing that has become clear is what's right for software is not right for society. We do all sorts of things in software. Good thing that the software can't speak on its own behalf, right? I mean, how often do you get on stage and denigrate old software, you rip out software, kind of savagely destroying lines and deleting them, and then gloating about it on social media, like you're howling over a corpse. Well, fortunately, software itself can't speak up and say, hey, you've done the wrong thing, because software's not a person. And we can do things to software that we should never do or never engage with in society. And we and software engineers have got a greater burden in society, so how do we proceed? Are we all just like Scrooge? Should we just feel bad about ourselves and go back to what we were doing before? No, we shouldn't. And there is good news in that the ACM, finally, revisited. Remember that code of ethics that we talked about at the beginning? The ACM has now revisited all that and rewritten it, and it's pretty good. So this came out just at the end of last year, summer of last year, and the new code of ethics, I think, is actually pretty good. And in particular, it's very principles-based. We're not going to get into the weeds of whether you've implemented the specification or not. We're going to focus on contributing to society and human well-being, avoiding harm, be honest and trustworthy. There's a shocking one for you. Be honest and trustworthy. You figure it out. You'll figure it out. Be honest and trustworthy. You know what I'm talking about. And the whole thing, actually, you can go at ethics.acm.org. They've also done, and actually one of the things that I really like that I hope gets really expanded is an Ask the Ethicist feature. And because I think that the key here with ethics is not answers. Don't seek answers. Seek to ask questions, tough questions, questions that may make people feel very uncomfortable, by the way, questions that won't necessarily have nice, neat answers. These questions are going to be complicated, but it is the act of asking them that allows us to consider them. If we don't ask them, we're going to simply do the wrong thing. So we need to be able to ask these questions. And I think that if you've got an organization in which question asking is encouraged, I think you will find that you will increasingly do the right thing, that you are less likely, I think, to move adrift with respect to these principles. But it's up to organizations to really initiate and support this discussion. So if you are an organizational leader in your organization, you need to encourage people to ask these questions, even, by the way, if you find them annoying or tedious, which you might. We had after the Gab incident, we asked ourselves a bunch of questions. We had a customer, for example, that sells tobacco in the UK. Should that be a customer? And that's an important question to ask. I'm not sure that there's a pat answer, but that's an important question to ask. And you want to encourage those questions to be asked, even if the answers are difficult or non-existent. So in terms of Andreessen's corollary, Andreessen's corollary, what follows from Andreessen's prophecy, is that we are going to be encountering these a lot. And we need to equip ourselves to be able to do this. And I think, actually, that in your organization, if you support this kind of questioning of larger endeavor, productive questioning of larger endeavor, I think that you will allow yourselves to have differentiation in the market, because I think what I see out there is actually there are a lot of software engineers, probably a lot of people in this room, who want to do the right thing. We want to be proud of our work. We don't want to create a platform that's used for violence. We don't want to create a car that kills people. We want to lift people up and delight them. That's what we want to do. And we, I think, are going to be drawn to those organizations who take that mission really seriously and allow their larger endeavor to be questioned. But understand that the ethical quandary is where we're going. They're not going to be pat answers, and it's our responsibility to ask them directly. Thank you very much. And with that,
Thanks, Bryan.
All right. So with that, I think we've got 3.5 minutes for questions. Is that fair?
We got time for a couple of questions. Yeah, sure.
So what I'm going to do is, because the whole point of this is asking questions, I'm going to hop onto the Slack after we're done, and I will answer questions such as they are. A lot of these questions are going to be unanswerable, but I will participate in that questioning until everyone runs out of steam. So that's what I'm going to do afterwards. But in the case of Tesla, isn't this more like a sales issue than a software development issue? Totally fair point. Hey, this is a marketing issue. I built the thing that actually does the thing that I was told to do. I built an SAE level 2 system. If that's being marketed as something else, that's marketing's problem. And I think not exactly. Don't get out of it. Don't let yourself off the hook that quickly. What are you doing inside your organization to actually correct that disconnect? When you look at other aspects about the vehicle, it's the fact that Tesla doesn't have LiDAR, that ain't a sales issue. That's not a marketing issue. That's an engineering issue. So I think we need to not be so quick to absolve ourselves of responsibility. Should I be concerned about people who, oh no, I guess not. About people who lose jobs to my automation solutions? That's a great question. How should I pursue that? Am I going to be developing software that's going to put people out of work? That's a great question to ask yourself. And I think that the specifics really matter. I mean, I'm not going to give you a pat answer. Should you ask yourself that question? Yes, absolutely. Does it mean that any software that actually eliminates a job is a problem? No, absolutely not. And if you look at the jobs in 1900, and then you look at the jobs in 1800, you look at the top 10 jobs, almost none of those jobs exist. They certainly don't exist among the top jobs. Society changes, people have to change, but you should take your responsibility seriously, and part of what I view as that is incumbent upon all of us is we need to lift more people up and allow more people to create software rather than simply being disrupted by it. What's the next question? Do you believe it's true that Google and YouTube lure users into propaganda videos, flat earth, and so on to make them stay watching? That has been emphatically true at times, where Facebook has deliberately created dissent, friction, conflict, extremism in an attempt to actually create eyeballs. And by the way, really inefficient eyeballs. You look at their conversion numbers on their ads, they're terrible. It's like the conversion numbers are not great. Only a small fraction of a % of people are clicking on this. The rest of people are disgusted by it one way or another. Why are we focusing on that small percentage? Oh, because they're actually revenue. That is a problem. It absolutely is a problem. And I think that they need to, honestly, if you want to put newspapers out of business, then could you please take on some of the societal responsibility that newspapers felt about how they held themselves in society? So I actually do think it's a problem. I think they have done it, and I think that, yes, how would you judge it? Thoroughly and repetitively. They need to, you cannot be deliberately focused on creating dissent because it's eyeballs. I'll take the question about what should we do, or what should Join do to address ethical dilemmas before they become tragedies. And this is where I would start with read ACM's updated Code of Ethics, because I think it's pretty good. Make sure the people on your team read ACM's Code of Ethics, because they're pretty good. And I would say kick off a discussion. In the software we build, what are the questions that we should be asking? Because again, this is about asking questions, and I think you will find that in the process of asking that questions, you'll get your own sense of clarity, and hopefully before they become tragedies. But they won't always. We're not going to be able to prevent everything, but we can at least take the responsibility to ask ourselves those questions. Do I have time for one more? Are we? No, we're done. I'm sorry. I'll be on Slack. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bryan.